Thank you, Chair. Antigua and Barbuda, if it's not too late, would love to join the Knowledge Management Working Group. Is that possible? Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I think the the other thing that we'd like to highlight, and this follows tremendously on the comments of my colleague from Nicaragua, and it builds somewhat on statements that were made by Peru, by Bahamas, and my colleague from Cuba. If we look as a region, and Mike is gone. Oh, if we look as a region, and we look at the many areas where we are deficient, we would lose. But the important thing is, we constantly, like the questions that we're asking, for instance, about Nobel Prize and where would we land and what would we achieve, or would we get a Nobel Prize? Do we want to sit back and wait for the criteria of other regions to judge the skills of our region? Or do we want to negotiate for ourselves the criteria by which we ourselves ought to be judged? The fact is, when we look at our region-specific concerns, they are not Eurocentric concerns. Those are concerns unique to us. But if we constantly look to Europe or to our big brother to the north and we allow their definition of us to define us, we will never progress. As a people, yesterday, for instance, and even today, we have had tailspins of independence and sovereignty and all the rest of it. Those are academic ideas that will just boomerang around and around and around. The very real reality, pedagogy and the science of pedagogy and the training of teachers is an essential component. But it's a matter that rightly belongs with the Education Committee. And that is a realm, as for those of us who were in Peru at last year's meeting, it is a realm that goes on to region-specific concerns to training teachers. We even had the regional meeting in Cuba last year, and we realized the problems we face are unique. I think what CELAC has with science, technology, and innovation is an opportunity to become the brain of how things ought to function within the region. Not to be dictated to as to what's important to us, but rather, what do we consider important to ourselves? I think once you're in this region, we all move from the premise of seeing the very bold example of the people of Cuba. Unlike any other people in this region, the Cubans have been forced to deal with the cards that they have been dealt. And in response, Cuba has responded with a litany of intellectual and other ideas that many of us, we sip at today. When Cuba's borders were closed and they could not trade in agricultural expertise or any other areas of food security, they developed the scientific know-how of how to solve their problems. When they could not communicate with the rest of the world with their medical concerns, today, Cuba, more than any other country in the Western Hemisphere, sends doctors and nurses around the world, from Cape Verde to the United States, yes, the United States, to Europe, to Africa. When we look at the expertise, for instance, and permit me to use Brazil, and Brazil's position towards energy independence, what are we going to learn? How can we learn the lessons in Brazil from China, or from Europe, or from the United States? We can best learn of them from Brazil. When we think of the work that Venezuela has been doing in oil, we can't learn those lessons from any other place. When we look at the work that Mexico, Peru, and Ecuador has been doing in agriculture, where are we going to find those expertise? To the European Union, or we go to the source themselves? When we want to think of the work that Costa Rica has been doing in environmental tourism, where's the best place to learn that? Isn't it Costa Rica? So we go to Costa Rica. What we're suggesting, or what Antigua and Barbuda is suggesting, when we look at the negatives are many, but the very real concerns that confront us are within ourselves. I heard an excellent idea coming from my colleague from Mexico, where he spoke about the Mexican Science Award. I don't know how many other countries have that science award that's taking place. I heard a very good idea from my colleague from Panama that spoke about creating the institutional awareness through which the financing mechanism can be tracked and channeled. Now, when we look all together, CELAC is already there. I think what needs to be done now is for us to quickly create that transition and identify the areas in which each of our countries are unique experts. And once we would have cataloged the area in which each nation or country is a unique expert, then we catalog it on a sub-regional level. Once we would have cataloged on the sub-regional level, then we catalog on a broader regional level between the Caribbean, between Latin America, and between South America. Now, the issue of funding always becomes a deterrent. But as was mentioned by my colleague from Nicaragua, many of the funding mechanisms already exist. Students from Antigua and Barbuda are already going to Cuba. We have almost 80 students in Cuba right now who are fluent in Spanish. We have about 20 students in Mexico right now. We have another 7 students in Venezuela. Those mechanisms are already there. What CELAC needs to do now is to create the forum so that we can showcase what is taking place. And instead of looking towards the Nobel Prize, we merely want to see how it is structured, and the best way to be as efficient as possible. But CELAC can redefine and determine its own prestige. If we look at the economies of Asia, for instance, and we look at the concept of branding, if we are to only limit ourselves to other people's brands, our brand will never be good enough. But if we look at people's brands, and when I say people, I mean other regions, if we look at the brands of other regions and we take what is the best practice and we create our own brand, we would have created our own commercialization of our ideas. Now, the issue of funding, that's why I gave concrete numbers when it comes to funding. We're going to be worrying about money, but guess what? If the United States brings in $98 billion a year from the revenue of people, not from their students, but from students that are coming from around the world to study in the United States, what's the possibility of our students studying medicine in some other country? And think of the immediate benefits that each individual country has to gain just from what they're already experts at. That is an avenue and an area which I think if we focus more on our strengths and rather
donde participan más de 300 especialistas del país, que precisamente se llama macroproyecto, que es de enfrentamiento al cambio climático. En cualquier momento, si lo entiende la presidencia, pero bueno, hemos traído algunas presentaciones, porque no estábamos muy ubicados, pero sí de esto, ¿no? Y también comunicarle que es las lecciones aprendidas. Nuestro país, no sé si ustedes conocen,